Hi there. My name is Nick Carver, and I'm a professional photographer and photography instructor. The following video presentation is a free sample from my How to Shoot in Full Manual online course. Now, this is just one of 9 video presentations on this course, totaling 2 hours of video instruction. The course also includes 6 in-depth weekly lesson guides, one of which can be downloaded for free on my website. So if you like what you see here, remember that this is just a tiny sampling of what is included in the entire course. If you'd like more information about this course and to download more free online photography course samples, please visit my website at nickcarverphotography.com/online courses. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey there, and welcome back for your next video presentation in the How to Shoot in Full Manual online course. Now this week we're talking all about the aperture. So the aperture, as we learned previously, is the adjustable opening in the lens that can be widened or narrowed to control how much light passes through it. So the aperture is that adjustable opening modeled after the human eye. It looks just like the human eye, and just like our pupils can dilate to let in more light and shrink down to cut off light, the aperture can do the same thing. Now it can be widened or narrowed to control how much light passes through it. So in very dark environments, it may be wise to open up that aperture real big so that you can let in as much of that dim light as possible. And keep in mind too that it's going to affect the shutter speed, whatever you do on the aperture. So if you take away light from the aperture by making it smaller, the shutter speed is going to have to compensate by staying open longer. And if you open up the aperture to let in more light, the shutter speed will have to compensate by speeding up. Now the aperture is measured in something called the f-stops, or the f numbers. Now these numbers are real funky, and they give people a lot of trouble because the decimal points in the numbers don't seem to have any rhyme or reason to them. You get weird decimal points like 2.8 and 7.1, and then you get up to the higher numbers and the decimal points just disappear. Well, these numbers are derived from a formula, and that formula has to do with some measurements inside the lens. And that also takes into account the area of a circle, because that's what you're dealing with here. And anytime you deal with the area of a circle, you're dealing with pi r squared. And anytime you're dealing with pi and anything squared, you start getting some weird numbers. So you don't need to know that formula. It's not going to help your photography at all, so I haven't covered it in this course. But that's why the numbers kind of don't seem to have much rhyme or reason to them. But the important thing to know about these numbers is that the smaller the f number, the bigger the opening. Now that whole backwards business trips up a lot of people, gives people a lot of grief, and I can understand why. I had the same problem when I was starting out. I would have to make a conscious effort to think, oh, a smaller number means a bigger opening. It'll eventually burn into where it's second nature and you don't have to actually think about it, but for now, that may give you a little bit of trouble. And if it is giving you trouble, don't feel bad. You're in good company. That's pretty much everybody. Now the aperture is obviously there to let in more or less light. That's the whole point. And the shutter speed is there to let in more or less light. But remember that the shutter speed had kind of a side effect on the image, which was motion blur. Well, the aperture has a side effect too. It's called depth of field. So the aperture affects the depth of field. Now we're going to look at depth of field very thoroughly in this video because it's really important to your photography, so it's good to get in control of it. Now the aperture is measured in the f-stops, and it moves in stops. That's why stops is in the term f-stops. So as we look at the aperture numbers here, we're going to look at wide to narrow from 2.8 to 32. So your lens may not go this wide. It may not go this small. Every lens is manufactured differently. Some stop at 2.8, some stop at 4, some stop at 5.6. Some go way beyond, all the way to 1.2. It just depends on how your lens was manufactured. But down at 2.8, we have what's considered a large opening, a large aperture. Now keep in mind that the way the aperture is referred to is by the size of the opening, not the number. So if you hear large aperture, think large opening. Because I remember when I started out, I would get confused when I read something like, use a small aperture when you're doing landscapes. And then I'm left wondering, well, does that mean a small aperture number or a small aperture opening? Because that's two very different things. Well, it means the size of the opening. So when you hear large aperture, it means the opening is large. When you hear small aperture, it means the opening is small. So a large aperture is going to let in a bunch of light for obvious reasons. It's like having a really big hose. A lot of water is going to get through a big hose, just like a lot of light is going to get through a big opening here. Down at 32, we have a small aperture. It's a small opening, so it's called a small or a narrow aperture. And that lets in very little light. Hardly any light can get in that tiny opening. So if we look at just the dark numbers on the screen here, remember when we covered the shutter speed, we looked at just the dark numbers on the screen and we saw a pattern there. We saw that the numbers were cutting in half or doubling, and that corresponded to stops. Well, do you see a pattern here going 2.8 to 4 to 5.6 to 8? I don't either. There is no pattern. You can't tell by looking at the aperture, and that's the unfortunate thing. The nice thing about the shutter speed is you can actually tell by looking at the numbers which was one stop more or less. But with the aperture, we're not so lucky. The only visual pattern here is the square root of 2. But that doesn't help you. It doesn't help anybody. These numbers are derived from a formula, remember. And if you were to work out the formula, you would find out that each one of these is one stop apart. In other words, f2.8 lets in twice as much light as 4, which lets in twice as much light as 5.6, which lets in twice as much light as 8, and so on and so on. But the aperture, unfortunately, is just not so neat and clean on the numbers like the shutter speed is. But either way, these are all one stop apart from each other. So as we go up this direction, we're going stops smaller because the opening is getting smaller, and that's letting in less light, so stops darker. If you ever hear the term or the phrase stopping down, that just means making your aperture smaller by a certain number of stops. You're just making the aperture smaller. It's a fancy way to say it. Now the opposite direction, we're going stops wider, which is letting in more light. So stops brighter, stops more light, stops wider. That would be called opening up. So if you hear I opened up the aperture, that means the opening was made bigger. So these are all one stop apart from each other. If I go 5.6 to 8, I just cut the light in half. 8 to 11, cut it in half again. And then we have third increments in between. So just like the shutter speed moved in third increments, the aperture moves in third increments. And that's so that they can cancel each other out. You let in 1/3 stop more with the shutter, 1/3 stop less with the aperture, and you get the same brightness. 2/3 stop more with the shutter, 2/3 stops less with the aperture, and you get the same brightness. Now, always remember that the smaller the f-stop number, the larger the aperture. Now that's that tricky backwards business that gives everyone trouble. Let me show you a little trick that's going to help remember this. It's going to help you remember this, and it also helps explain why that is. Because believe it or not, the numbers aren't backwards just to confuse you. There actually is a reason for it. If we look at f4 and f8 and f20, and you turn the f's into a 1, suddenly it makes a little more sense. 1/4 is bigger than 1/8, which is bigger than 1/20, and the opening is bigger. So the reason that works is that the f numbers are actually ratios. They're fractions. So when you see f4, it's actually f divided by 4. When you see f8, it's actually f divided by 8. f20 is f divided by 20. So that's why the bigger numbers are the smaller openings. Now what's f? F divided by a number, what's the f mean? Well, the f is the variable in the formula for how they figure out these numbers. And that f is representing focal length. And the focal length is how much your lens is zoomed in. Now that's just some fun facts for you math geeks out there, but if that's just confusing to you, don't worry. You don't need to know that formula or anything, but just keep in mind that the bigger numbers are the smaller openings because the f number is actually a fraction, f divided by a number. So that's why we have wide to narrow, small number to big number. Now the aperture affects the depth of field. And the depth of field is just a fancy term for describing how much is in focus from near to far. The field is what's in focus. That's a highfalutin term for field, or for focus. Depth of field is how deep that field is. So depth of field is the area of the image that appears in focus from front to back. So near to far, how much you have in focus is the depth of field. So a small depth of field, which depth of field is often abbreviated DOF, a small depth of field would mean you have a blurry background. and a blurry foreground, but it's just oftentimes you don't have anything in the foreground to show as blurry. A big depth of field would mean you have a sharp background, you have a lot in focus. So a small, a narrow, a shallow depth of field, that all means the background's blurry. A big, a large, a wide depth of field means you have a lot in focus. Now the way the aperture affects that is a larger aperture, so read that as a bigger opening. So we're thinking numbers like 2.8 and 4 and 1.2. That creates a smaller depth of field. You get less in focus. A smaller aperture, that'd be a smaller opening, numbers like f22, f32, f45. Those smaller openings give you more in focus. So as the opening gets smaller, things sharpen up. You get sharper backgrounds. Now, why does it work that way? I don't know. I should probably learn that one day, but honestly, it doesn't improve your photography at all, so I just haven't put time into learning it. But that's just the way physics works. It's just the way optics work. For whatever reason, when you look through a smaller opening, backgrounds get sharper. Now, you know this. We all know this. I'm going to prove to you that you know this fact. We've all known it since birth, pretty much, and we all instinctually know it. Because what do you do when you have a hard time reading something that's blurry? Or if something's way off in the distance that you can't really tell what it is? You tend to squint down. So you close your apertures down on your eyes to try and sharpen things up. So that's why we'll squint to read something that's blurry or try and discern something way off in the distance. We know that closing down apertures sharpens things up. Now it's also an old trick that if you have poor vision, instead of looking through glasses, you can just poke a pinhole in a piece of paper and look through it, and now things are sharper. So for whatever reason, the world is set up in such a way that smaller openings sharpen things up. So it's going to look something like this. This would be a small or a narrow depth of field that was taken at f4. That's a big opening. So we'd get not much in focus. Just the post here, and everything closer blurs out and everything further away blurs out. But if I close down to f32, now I get a big depth of field. So I get the near things and the far things in focus. Depth of field extends out to include them all. You'll notice the background isn't completely sharp. Depth of field can be expanded, but not necessarily infinitely. 32 is the smallest aperture I had on that lens, and it gave me the biggest depth of field I could get, but it still wasn't all the way to the background. Now, if we look at it from a side view here, this is how it's working. Let's say I'm at this camera taking a picture at f4. And I focus on that tree. Well, at f4, that's a pretty wide aperture, which gives me a small depth of field. So I may only get that much in focus, just the front of the tree to the back of the tree. But if I take f4 and I close it down to f11, depth of field expands out and I get more in focus. Now you'll notice the depth of field came towards the camera and away from the camera. It works that way in real life. You'll also notice that the depth of field is further behind your subject than it is in front of your subject. Works that way in real life too. Depth of field extends about 2/3 away from you, 1/3 towards you. So that's why it's not just background, it's also foreground. It's just normally we don't have anything between the camera and the subject, so we never get to see the foreground getting sharper. If I close down to 22, depth of field expands out even more to include this entire landscape. So when you want everything in focus like on a landscape, you tend to close the aperture down. If you want a blurry background like on a portrait, you open the aperture up. So let's watch the progression here. Starting at f4. Now I'm going to take my aperture and I'm going to close it down 2 stops at a time until I reach f32. And keep an eye on how this sharpens up and that sharpens up, how the foreground and background sharpen up as I do that. So starting at f4, I'm going to close it down 2 stops to f8. Things are a little bit sharper now. Close it down 2 stops again to f16. They're a little sharper still. I close it down 2 stops again to f32, and now we have a much better sharpness. So the total jump from f4 to f32 was 6 stops smaller, which is 6 stops less light. Now it's 6 stops less light, and yet the picture is not any darker. And that's because although I took away 6 stops of light with the aperture, I was able to just add 6 stops of light with a longer shutter. Now let's see how good you are with stops. So let's say at f4, my shutter speed came out to 1/250th, 1 over 250. If you want to find that on your cheat sheet right now, go for it. I'm going to ask you to find the shutter speed for the next shot. But at f4, I get 1/250th. Now, let's say I'm going to take my aperture and close it down to f32, 6 stops smaller. And I want to keep the same brightness. Well, what's going to happen to the shutter speed? It's going to have to slow down to let in more light. I was originally at 1/250th on the shutter here. Now I'm 6 stops smaller, so I'm going to have to go 6 stops longer on the shutter. See if you can figure out what shutter speed that would be. If you want to get a chance to figure it out, pause the video real quick, come on back, I'll tell you the right answer. So by changing from f4 to f32, 6 stops smaller, my shutter speed would have to go from 1/250th to 6 stops longer at 1/4. That's what my shutter speed would come out to here. If I take away 6 stops on the aperture, I got to add 6 stops on the shutter. And 6 stops longer from 1/250th is 1/4. So here's some wide aperture examples. These would be anytime I want to blur out backgrounds. Good for portraits to isolate my main subject. It's good for close-ups to isolate my smaller subjects and let the background blur out so you look right where I want you to. So these are all big openings, and they're all blurring backgrounds nicely. Now they're also letting in a bunch of light because they're big openings. So what do you think happened to my shutter speed on these shots? Was it able to be fast, or did it have to be slow? Now if I have a big opening, I'm letting in a bunch of light. That means the shutter won't have to let in as much. So on these shots, I was able to use fast shutter speeds because the aperture was letting in so much light that the shutter speed didn't have to. Now one thing I want to point out here is you'll notice that sometimes you'll take a picture at, like, say 5.6 and it won't give you a background this blurry. So you may be wondering, like, I looked on my lesson and it said 5.6 would give me a real blurry background like in these examples, and I'm not getting that. Well, that's because there's actually 2 other things that affect depth of field. One is how close you are to your subject. The closer you get to your subject, the blurrier the background gets, the smaller the depth of field gets. So if I take a picture at f5.6 of a subject that's 12 inches away, depth of field is going to be razor thin, it's going to be tiny. But if I use that same lens and that same camera and that same aperture of 5.6 to photograph a mountain that's 5 miles away, depth of field is going to be huge. Even though my aperture is wide open, my depth of field will grow immensely because my subject is so far away. So the closer you get to your subject, the smaller the depth of field gets. Now the other thing that affects depth of field is how zoomed in you are. The more zoomed in you are, the smaller the depth of field gets. So if I'm using a 100 millimeter lens at 5.6, I'm going to get a blurrier background than a 16 millimeter lens at 5.6. So if you want the blurriest background possible, open up the aperture as wide as it can go, get closer to your subject, and zoom in more. So tight shots, like on portraits, if you want to get a real blurry background on a portrait, do a tight shot. Zoom in so it's just from chest to just above the head. If you try and do the full body, you won't get as blurry of a background because you have to zoom out or move back. So get closer, zoom in, and use a wide aperture. That's how you get blurry backgrounds. Now narrow apertures here, these would be anytime you want to get everything in focus. It's good for landscapes and cityscapes. So I use small apertures here, big numbers like 29 and 20 and 14 and 16. All of these apertures are giving me a lot in focus, which is great. But they're not letting in very much light because the opening itself is very small. And since they're not letting in very much light, what has to happen to the shutter speed? It has to slow down. So if I close my aperture down real small, the aperture or the shutter speed has to slow down to compensate for that lack of light. And that's why all of these shots had to be done on a tripod. Now a couple of these photos you can actually see that I had to use a slow shutter speed. On this picture of Seattle here, we have traffic on the road here that is streaked. It has bands of light because the shutter speed was slow. Also, this boat right here wouldn't hold still for me, so it's a little bit blurry from the slow shutter speed. This one here, you can see the waves are kind of soft from moving during that slow shutter speed. But if nothing else is moving, it won't show up as blur because it doesn't have a chance to move. That's why these ones don't look blurry at all. So those small apertures will give you everything in focus, or at least more in focus, but it's going to be at the penalty of a slower shutter speed. So you may have to get onto a tripod when you use those small apertures. So that's the aperture and how stops play into the aperture. Head on back to your weekly lesson guide. I have an assignment for you where you're going to get to play with depth of field a little bit. There's also some written questions, seeing how good you do with the math as it pertains to the apertures, the stops relating to apertures. Head on back and complete that assignment. And if you have any questions on anything, you can always email me at nc@nickcarverphotography.com.